Chapter 5: The Media and Claims. Analyses of the mass media's role in the social problems process often focus on the issue of bias. Conservative critics charge that the media systematically presents a liberal point of view. Quote Barnes 2004. The argument over whether the national press is dominated by liberals is over. Since 1962, there have been 11 surveys of the media that sought the political views of hundreds of journalists, and the proportion of liberals to conservatives in the press, either 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, has stayed the same. That liberals are dominant is now beyond dispute. End quote, Barnes 2004. Meanwhile, liberals counter that the media have a conservative bias. Quote Alterman, 2003. Even the genuine liberal media are no match, either in size, ferocity, or commitment, for the massive conservative media structure that, more than ever, determines the shape and scope of our political agenda. End quote, Alterman 2003. These critiques address the news media that report information, such as newspapers, news magazines, and radio and television news broadcasts, but also the entertainment media, such as television dramas, novels, or movies, and so-called infotainment that uses entertaining formats to discuss social issues, such as television talk shows or reality shows that depict police at work. All forms of media coverage tend to alter how social problems are constructed, although not necessarily in the ways that critics of media bias imagine. The social problems process typically begins with claims making that precedes the media's involvement. Usually, activists or experts present the initial or primary claims, quote Best 1990. Unless these claims makers are insiders who have ready access to policymakers, see chapters 3 and 4, they probably hope that the media will cover their claims, thereby bringing those claims before a larger audience than the claims makers could hope to reach on their own. Newspaper stories, talk show episodes, or movies with plots involving troubling conditions can bring claims to the attention of millions of people in the general public, as well as policymakers. However, media coverage almost inevitably alters the claims that it presents. Media workers face their own constraints. They work under deadlines, so they rarely have time to become thoroughly familiar with the claims they cover. Their presentations are usually constricted. For example, newspapers can print only so many inches of news per day. Journalists call this the news hole. And television news programs have only so many broadcast minutes available, and they need to make their coverage interesting enough that the audience won't stop reading or watching. The media then translates and transforms claims makers' messages into what we will call secondary claims, typically by making them shorter, more dramatic, and less ideological than original primary claims. Because there are many claims makers and the media can cover only a limited number of stories, claims makers find themselves competing for media attention. Savvy claims makers realize that they need to package their claims so as to interest the media in covering them. The media prefer to cover new, seemingly fresh material, so it is important to present claims in a novel way. The first sit in or peace march may get a lot of coverage, but each additional sit in or march is likely to get less unless it offers an interesting new angle. The media like to be able to plan their coverage in advance, so it helps to issue press releases and schedule press conferences so that reporters know when and where they can find someone willing to talk with them. The media favor claims presented by interesting people, so claims makers need to find spokespersons who seem engaging. Note how often claims making campaigns use either celebrities interesting in their own right or highly dramatic figures such as parents who have suffered the loss of a child to present their claims. Television seeks visually interesting material that can accompany a story, so claims makers favor marches, demonstrations, and other easy to film ways of presenting their claims. In the competition for media attention, claims makers who take the media's needs into account have an advantage. Sub The author's last name spelled Sobieraj. Sobiraj, 2011. I apologize for any mispronunciation. Hillgartner and Bosk, 1988, suggest that the marketplace for social problems can be understood as composed of multiple arenas. Each arena is a venue where social problems claims can be presented. The pages of a news magazine, a TV talk show, or the hearings of a congressional subcommittee are all arenas. Each arena has a limited carrying capacity for presenting claims. Magazines have only so many pages per issue. Talk shows schedule a set number of episodes per season. Subcommittees only hold a limited number of hearings, and so on. Cat wanted to jump on the desk. In chapters 3 and 4, we considered the perspective of claims makers, who understand that they are competing for attention in various arenas. In this chapter, we will adopt the perspective of those who work in the media. We can think of them as managing different arenas and having the job of sorting through all the competing claims and choosing which ones will receive attention in their arena. In general, sociologists who have observed how news reporters and editors decide which stories to cover and how to cover them conclude that bias, in the sense of an underlying political ideology, is less important in shaping how the news is covered than the nature of the work that reporters and editors do. This chapter begins by considering the nature of those jobs and the parallel considerations that shape how social problems are treated in the entertainment and social are treated in entertainment and social media before examining the forms that secondary claims tend to take. This chapter ends with a caution against exaggerating the media's influence. Section titled, What's the News? The term news work draws our attention to the fact that reporters and editors have the job of locating and presenting news to the larger public. Like all other occupations, news work has constraints. Quote, Shudson 2011, Tuckman 1978. Some constraints are economic. It costs money to collect and produce news, and news workers operate within budgets. So newspapers and television news operations can afford only so many employees. The news hole, that is, the number of available column inches or broadcast minutes, can contain only so many stories, and so on. Other constraints are cultural. News workers have their own understanding of what they should do. That is, their sense of professionalism also shapes their coverage. News workers operate under pressure. They have schedules and deadlines. Newspapers and magazines need to reach the printer on schedule, just as radio and television programs need to be ready in time for their broadcasts. News workers cannot simply sit back and wait for the news to happen and come to their attention. Rather, they must try to plan ahead, to anticipate what might be and ought to be covered. Many news organizations assign reporters to beats, which are types of news that are expected to generate suitable stories. For example, a reporter on the police beat covers stories about crimes. News workers are also drawn to predictable events. A scheduled demonstration or even a press conference can be attractive precisely because reporters and editors have some sense in advance of what sorts of stories those events might generate. News workers are also judged of some stories as being more deserving of coverage than others. Most obviously, they consider some stories to be more important or, as they say, more newsworthy. Important stories involve consequential events, things about which people need to know. But importance depends on the news worker's audience. Imagine a passenger jet crashing and killing, say, 150 people. How much attention should a newspaper give that story? If the crash occurred in the city where the newspaper is published, we can imagine this dramatic local story consuming most of the front page. If it occurred, say, in a city 1,000 miles away, and if there were other compelling news stories competing for the paper's attention, the crash story might well be pushed off the front page. If the crash occurred in a foreign country, and especially if no Americans were killed, it is unlikely to receive no more than a paragraph or two somewhere well inside the paper. In other words, it is not just the death toll that makes a story seem important, but also the story's perceived relevance to the paper's readers. In addition to being of varying importance, stories strike news workers as being more or less interesting to their audience. Television news, for example, favors stories that can be accompanied by videotaped footage showing something happening. The earliest television news broadcasts featured newscasters facing the cameras and reading stories to the audience. Television workers soon realized, however, that theirs was a visual medium, and the audience found these talking heads boring. There is, then, a strong preference for having some sort of videotaped action to illustrate the story, even if the activity shown is mundane. This explains why stories about ongoing trials, where cameras are often forbidden in the courtroom, routinely feature footage of trial participants walking into the courthouse to accompany the sound of the reporter describing what is happening that day in court. There are, of course, other ways of making stories interesting. Like claims generally, news stories often begin with typifying examples. For example, a story on homelessness might begin by describing the experiences of one or two particular homeless individuals, such an introduction puts a human face on the story and gives the problem human interest. Stories that seem less interesting can easily lose out in competition for media attention. News workers will favor covering stories that can be presented in an interesting manner. Another quality of an attractive story is novelty. Notice the very word news, that is, what's new. In general, news workers prefer stories that are current, especially, quote, breaking news, and that seem different. Fresh news is preferred to stories that seem too familiar and have grown stale. After all, if there isn't something new to report, why should news workers expect the audience to pay any attention? This means that familiar, troubling conditions that affect many people, such as world hunger, may not attract nearly as much media attention as the latest sex scandal or lurid murder. In assembling the stories they report, news workers apply other professional standards as well. For example, when the story's subject is clearly an issue about which people disagree, many news workers consider themselves obligated to balance their coverage by reporting the views of both sides. This expression reveals an assumption that most issues only have two sides, pro and con, liberal and conservative, etc. The news media often resist reporting complex stories in which there are more than two competing positions. They prefer to construct the issue as a straightforward two-party disagreement. Note, too, that news workers do not feel the need to balance coverage when they perceive a general unanimity of opinion concerning what Chapter 2 calls valence issues. If there is general widespread agreement that, say, child pornography is bad, then reporters will not consider themselves obliged to balance their coverage by reporting the views of child pornographers. Because most news workers keep track of coverage by rival news organizations, they often feel they ought to follow one another's lead. The very fact that another newspaper or newscast is covering a story suggests that the story must be newsworthy. When several news organizations rush to follow the same lead, the result can be a wave of news coverage. This often happens with social problems coverage, which is why criminologists have long understood that crime waves are not so much waves in criminal activity as waves in news coverage. Citation Vasterman 2018. Considerations such as importance, interest, novelty, balance, and what other news organizations are covering shape how news workers construct the news. These are inevitably matters of judgment, with editors making choices, deciding which stories deserve more attention, which stories deserve less, and which can be ignored. See Box 5.2. In some cases, news workers may act as primary claims makers. That is, they might originate the claims making through their coverage. For social problems claims makers, the challenge is to construct claims that will strike news workers as sufficiently important and interesting to merit news coverage. Sophisticated claims makers learn to take the news workers' concerns into account. They make it easy to cover their claims by, for example, staging demonstrations and other events that will seem interesting and therefore newsworthy. They schedule these events and press conferences in advance so that news workers will know when and where to go to get their stories. They design articulate spokespersons who can present the claims, answer reporters' questions, and help them identify suitable, typifying examples. And they devise novel, visually interesting ways of presenting their claims, new forms of demonstrations, new evidence, and such, so that their message seems fresh and the story well suited for television. For instance, a small San Francisco prostitutes' rights movement managed to attract a great deal of media attention by organizing the quote first annual hookers ball end quote citation Genes 1993. Understanding the news media's concern allows claims makers to package their claims in ways that will appeal to news workers and thereby make it more likely that those claims will, in fact, become the subject of news coverage. News workers are not naive. They understand that experienced claim makers tailor their campaigns to attract news coverage. On the one hand, news workers may be wary of being manipulated. They particularly want to avoid wasting time covering a story that will strike them and their audiences as familiar and boring. They want to be convinced that the information they're being given is fresh, accurate, and interesting. They have no interest in attending yet another press conference where the same speakers make the same old claims. Still, depending on what rival stories are under consideration, it may be easier to cover a well packaged story. There are, after all, quote, slow news days when there seems to be a shortage of newsworthy stories, just as summer has long been known among journalists as dog days or the silly season, months when the federal government and other news generating institutions are less active, so competition for coverage is less intense, and it is easier for offbeat stories to attract news coverage. A well assembled claim can often become very attractive to news workers if there aren't strong alternative stories competing for attention. Geography also plays a role in the process. News workers are not evenly distributed across the country. Rather, they are concentrated in larger cities. Citation Best 1999. In particular, three cities have exceptionally large concentration of news workers. New York is the nation's largest city, and it remains the traditional base for such important news media as the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And the three major television networks news broadcasts. Los Angeles is the second largest city, and as the center of the entertainment industry, it has its own concentration of news media. And third, Washington, D.C. is the center of the federal government and attracts a vast army of news workers devoted to covering the government's actions. Events that occur near such concentrations of news workers are more likely to attract coverage. Such geographic concentrations of news workers are important because where there are more reporters, there are more opportunities for claims makers to get their claims covered. There is nothing to keep people from making claims in small towns and a remote rural location, but it is more difficult to get the news workers to travel there to cover the story. It is far easier for a claim to gain widespread attention if the claims makers bring their case to a major media center, to a location where many news workers will have convenient access to the story. Thus, even claims makers who begin in distant places tend to migrate to larger media centers. All of this is to say that the news is a social construction produced by news workers operating under various constraints that force them to make choices, to prefer stories that can be covered in ways that fit their sense of what good news ought to be. Claims makers who ignore these considerations do so at their own peril. New section: Changing News Media. Note that the news media's forms shift over time. During television's first 30 years, the great majority of Americans relied on broadcast signals. Even those living in fairly large urban centers might receive signals from only half a dozen stations. The three major news networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, originally ran 15-minute news broadcasts on weekdays, which were expanded to 30 minutes in the early 1960s, then later to 6 days per week. In addition, local stations offered their own news broadcasts a couple of times a day. Today, most households receive either cable or satellite television signals or other online services offering access to dozens, if not hundreds, of channels. Several channels offer round the clock news coverage. This shift has had all manner of consequences. The audience for the network's evening news broadcast has grown smaller as viewers turn to all news channels at more convenient times. The audience for print journalism, both newspaper and weekly news magazines, has also declined as more people rely on electronic media for their news. And some cable networks have begun to adopt overt editorial stances, as the emergence of Fox News as unabashedly conservative news illustrates. Let UCAS 2014. For claims makers, one important consequence of these changes in the media is that competing 24-hour news channels have a colossal appetite for fresh stories. See Box 5.3. In television's early years, five when the networks broadcast 5 15-minute news shows per week, it was far tougher to get an issue covered on national television than it is today. Television's carrying capacity for news has increased vastly. On the other hand, as their on the other hand, as their advertising has declined, newspapers and news magazines have been shrinking in size, so their carrying capacity has grown smaller. As television channels have increased in number, they have increasingly aimed at targeted audiences. Theorists once worried about the mass media that would turn society into an undifferentiated mass receiving the same media message. Citation, Turo, 1997. In practice, the media find it more profitable to practice audience segmentation, to aim at a particular demographic group. Because people fit in particular demographic profiles defined by age, sex, income, and so forth, they are more likely to watch programs aimed directly at their interests. The audience for those programs will be relatively homogeneous, and the advertisers who believe their customers will be concentrated in that segment of the larger audience will prefer and even pay a premium to place their ads on those programs. Thus, there are cable channels aimed at women, Spanish speakers, people in particular age groups, and so on, just as websites are aimed at people with distinctive interests or concerns. A similar process changed magazine publishing. General interest magazines such as Life, that once sought to appeal to huge mass audiences, folded long ago. The titles that remain aim at people with particular interests. Audience segmentation affects the media's role in the social problems process. Because different television channels or magazines seek to appeal to demographically distinct audiences, their coverage of claims making will reflect their sense of which issues will strike their viewers or readers as interesting and relevant. Because advertisers often favor more affluent customers who can afford their products, the news media are less likely to target poorer audiences, which means that social problems coverage tends to downplay claims of greater concern to the poor and the powerless. Newspapers' economic reporting, for instance, tends to devote far more attention to the concerns of corporations than to those of workers or the unemployed. Citation Kohlmeier, 2004. The consequences of audience segmentation for social problems claims making is that although it is becoming easier to gain media attention, media coverage for claims, that coverage is often tailored for the particular audience that follows the television programs or magazines that choose to cover the claims. See Box 5.4. The obvious example of changing media is the emergence of the Internet. Citation Mar Atia, 2014. The Internet is a boon to claims makers in that websites, discussion groups, and blogs can be established quite easily and at minimal cost. Claims of all sorts can be posted and made accessible to anyone who knows how to use a search engine. In effect, the Internet has an unlimited carrying capacity. Because there's little in the way of filtering, the Internet offers a forum for even the most controversial claims, and sites can be cloaked so as to conceal the poster's identity. Citation Daniels, 2009. However, it becomes difficult for news workers to evaluate the various claims that wind up posted in cyberspace. In contrast, those working in print and broadcast journalism routinely sort through prospective stories and have standards for rejecting some claims. Moreover, posting a claim does not guarantee that it will gain a large audience. Bloggers have learned to encourage traffic to their sites by providing mutual links to other sites. Still, it seems likely that the internet will have a long-term effect on claims making. In some instances already, websites or bloggers have forced more established news media to cover particular issues by breaking stories about those issues. Thus, the news media's structure is changing. Some media, such as newspapers and magazines, are losing part of their audience, shrinking their coverage, and becoming less influential. Others, such as television news, are expanding their coverage and shifting forms by, for example, becoming more openly ideological. At the same time, news internet based forums such as blogs, websites, and electronic discussion groups are emerging. Thus far, these changes seem to make it easier to gain some sort of media coverage of claims, although because the target audiences for different media tend to be smaller and more homogeneous, it is not generally easier to bring claims to the attention of a broad, general audience. New section: Packaging social problems in the news. In short, the nature of news work and the structure of news industry shapes which stories are covered and the form that coverage takes. In particular, news about claims making tends to display some fairly clear patterns. Subsection: The advantages of news issue ownership. First, remember that particular claims makers sometimes assume ownership of their social problems. That is, they become widely recognized as the authorities on the problem and especially knowledgeable. One of the principal benefits of such ownership is that when news workers find themselves covering a story related to a certain social problem, they routinely turn to the problem's owners for comments. This status is self reinforcing. Once the media have used particular activists or experts as sources for one story, they are more likely to seek out the same source for future related stories. Of course, achieving ownership is easier for some people than for others. The news media frequently turns to government officials as sources for their news, and other experts have credentials that make their comments seem particularly authoritative. The news media also favor covering people who are already well known. Thus, when movie stars or other celebrities enlist in claims making campaigns, they often draw press attention. Another way to claim ownership and control the media message is for take two. Another way to claim ownership and control the media message is for corporations or other interest groups to run advertising that presents their claims. Citation Silver and Boyle, 2010. In short, the news media prefer to collect their information from those who they already have high status. The flip side of ownership arises when the media defines some claims makers as lacking the legitimacy to deserve coverage. We might call these dispossessed claims makers. That is, they are opposite of owners. News workers may view people who are poor, who lack power, wealth, or high status as less newsworthy, and claims makers representing these people find it hard to get their claims covered. Similarly, those with views considered too far outside the mainstream, too unpopular, or too radical, find it much harder to gain media coverage for their claims. Remember, the media often tries to balance their coverage by presenting, quote, both sides of an issue, typically understood to mean liberals and conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans. Those who adopt other, very different positions, who are too radical or too reactionary, who hold unpopular beliefs or values, usually find it difficult to break into the news media that have the largest audiences. As a result, claims makers whose rhetoric strikes news workers as too far outside the mainstream. Sorry, my cat's meowing. Take two. As a result, claims makers whose rhetoric strikes news workers as too far outside the mainstream, think of vegans, hate groups, or unfamiliar new religions, may find themselves ignored by the major media news outlets. Those newspapers, news magazines, and television networks with the largest audiences tend to concentrate their coverage on less controversial claims. Dispossession also reflects the news media's efforts to appeal to their target audiences. Although we might imagine that newspapers or television news broadcasts want to gain the largest possible audience, audience segmentation leads them in practice to be more concerned with reaching some people than others. Citation Hamilton 2004. One moment. Thank you for your patience. Kitties need fed. Resuming, in practice, although we might imagine the newspapers or television news broadcasts wanting to gain the largest possible audience, audience segmentation leads them in practice to be more concerned with reaching some people than others. Citation Hamilton 2004. Advertisers are more likely to place their ads in media that reach particular types of consumers, and editors may favor stories that will appeal to their target audience. To the degree that social problems claims address troubling conditions thought to be of concern to that target audience, it is easier to get coverage. Claims that may be of more concern to people outside the target audience have a tougher time getting covered. Again, advertisers, and therefore the news media, tend to be especially interested in reaching more affluent audience members and less interested in attracting poor readers and viewers. Therefore, claims about problems that face the poor may have a harder time gaining news coverage. Not all social problems come to have owners, because claims makers must themselves choose which issues are most important. Citation Best, 1999. Consider the media coverage of school shootings that began in 1998. There were several highly publicized incidents, most notably, of course, at Columbine High School in 1999. Various claims makers sought to explain these episodes, but the cacophony of explanations was remarkable. School shootings were blamed on insufficient gun control laws, violent video games, the goth subculture, bullying, theaters admitting those under 17 into R rated movies, the gun culture, Cartoon Network, smartphones, Fig Newtons, I'm just making some stuff up now. I'm sorry. It was just getting so boring. Um, this is a common pattern. Reports of novel sorts of violent crime often lead to all kind of commentators offering competing explanations and solutions. In the case of school shootings, none of these explanations emerged as dominant. That is, no single set of claims makers assumed ownership. Why not? Probably because school shootings were not central to the causes of any of the commentators who spoke out on the issues. Gun control activists, for example, saw school shootings as just one small part of the larger gun problem. They wanted to continue to draw attention to all aspects of that problem rather than focus on school shootings. The emergence of ownership requires claims makers who are motivated to continue promoting an issue, as well as news workers who treat those claims makers as authoritative. Subsection: the dominance of landmark narratives. Second, particular typifying examples, what are called landmark narratives, often come to dominate news coverage of a topic. Citation Nichols, 1997. That is, a particular case may become the central focus of media coverage of a social problem, the subject of more newspaper and magazine articles than other similar cases, or represented in more of the video clips that accompany numerous TV news stories on the topic. Just as the typifying examples chosen by claims makers are often quite atypical, more serious, dramatic, or troubling than most cases, so news workers choose landmark or iconic narratives not because they accurately reflect the larger problem, but because they are the stuff of compelling news. These cases serve as landmarks in two senses. They guide news workers thinking about the nature of the problem and how it should be covered, and they shape the terms by which the news audience understands the problem. Subsection: constructing packages. Third, landmark cases often belong to larger constructions called packages. Citation: Beckett 1996, Gamson 1992, Gamson and Modagahani 1989. A package is a familiar, more or less coherent view of a social issue, including its causes and what ought to be done about it. A package has a core idea or frame. For example, arguments that climate change is substantially caused by human activities, that it poses a serious threat, and that the steps needed to be taken to minimize the problem are at a core of one familiar package. Similarly, arguments that climate change is not necessarily caused by human activities and may not constitute a serious threat are a frame for a rival package. Within a package, there is room for disagreement. People may accept the same basic frame yet disagree about specifics, such as the exact processes that cause the problem or what needs to be done about it. Not everyone who shares the same basic concern about climate change has to agree on every aspect of the package. See Box 5.5. In addition, packages offer condensing symbols, shorthand elements, landmark narratives, typifying examples, slogans, visual images, and so on that evoke the package. Editorial cartoons and newspapers depend on the fact that readers will understand such symbols. A figure in a Klansman robe and hood denotes racism. A smokestack belching smoke symbolizes pollution, and so on. Similarly, a bumper sticker slogan, "When guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns," can encapsulate a larger package of ideas about guns and gun control. Condensing signals remind people of the larger package, which presents claims that define the nature of the problem, its causes, and a vision of what ought to be done about it. Note that packages draw on the larger stock of cultural resources. Like primary claims makers designing their claims, news workers want to assemble coverage that seems sensible to them and that will also seem sensible to their audiences. Their stories then incorporate the culture that they are taking for granted, values, symbols, worldviews, and so on. These underlying assumptions are invisible to those who share them, although they may seem quite glaring to others. Consider American shock when they discovered that during the hostage crisis of 79 and 80, perhaps the first time serious tensions with the Muslim world became apparent, Iranian media had described the United States as the Great Satan. In most cases, however, the ways news coverage draws on cultural resources that are taken for granted goes unnoticed. Media packages help organize people's thinking about social problems. News workers sort through many, if not all, of the available claims, select some as newsworthy of coverage, and give that coverage shape. The packages they choose may change over time. News workers' choices are influenced by the nature of the claims they encounter, but also by other considerations, including the need to produce news under pressure of news work, the range of available stories competing for coverage, the desirability of tailoring coverage to the target audience, and so on. Social problems packages are one outcome of this process. They give the news media's secondary claims a sense of coherence. Among all the things that might be said about race or crime or anything else, these become the most visible positions. It is relatively easy for the public to become familiar with the packages presented by the news media, and considerably harder for people to learn other ways to think about social problems. Packages help make the media coverage of social problems seem more coherent. They turn a lot of information into a story, a word that is significant because it reminds us that the news is often presented as narratives. Citation Nichols, Nolan, and Coiler, 2008. In the process, some elements are highlighted while others are pushed to one side. This helps explain why analyses of media content regularly find that the depictions of people or events mere popular images of problems and are less accurate reflections of official measures of problem dimensions. Our notions of who is likely to be victimized by a hate crime or what it is like to be poor not only derive from images presented in the media, but also shape the imagery the media choose to present. It is possible to exaggerate the media's role in packaging social problems. They do not have a completely free hand. News workers have to derive and present packages that they believe will make sense to their audience. American culture, for example, places great weight on the idea of individual responsibility. This idea runs through much common sense thinking about life. We tend to hold individuals responsible for their circumstances. People who are poor, overweight, or addicted to drugs bear most Americans agree, uh, of the blame for their troubles. It is then relatively easy to devise frames and packages in which individual responsibility plays a key role, but much harder, for instance, to present explanations that argue that individuals' actions are largely determined by social forces. New section. Is it just entertainment? We assume that the news media will cover social problems. After all, it is their job to report on serious matters. But social problems claims are also picked up by a wide range of entertainment media and are portrayed in what is called popular culture. Television talk shows, for instance, often present episodes focused on particular sorts of relationship problems, addictions, and the like. But even fictional genres such as mystery novels adopt topics from the news. When missing children became a national concern, fictional detective heroes tried to find missing kids. Once stalking attracted notice, some of those same heroes confronted stalkers, and so on. And just as the demands of newswork shape how the news media covers social problems, entertainment media are constrained by conventions that affect how they construct social problems. Citation Martia and Monahan, 2016. Every pop culture genre has its own conventions and constraints, a formula that it follows. Television situation comedies need joke filled scripts that will last about 23 minutes, 30 minutes less the time for commercials, and etc. etc. In romance novels, the main character fall in love, and the comic book superheroes confront and defeat supervillains. The people who produce popular culture follow these formulas because they are known to work. That is, they appeal to each genre's respective audience. Romance authors, editors, and publish, for instance, doubt that their readers want stories about people who can't find love. These formulas shape how entertainment media deal with social problems claims. Although popular culture often reflects current social problems claims with stories ripped from the headlines, its depictions of those claims must conform to the different formulas' requirements. Citation Gitlin, 1983. For example, to be dramatic, a confrontation requires an uncertain outcome. This means that the hero must face a villain who seems capable of winning. For instance, detective heroes, whether on television or in mystery novels, must be matched with powerful lawbreakers. As a result, fictional criminals tend to be far more powerful than their real world counterparts. Fictional child molesters belong to organized rings of wealthy abusers. Drug dealers are millionaire industrialists, or gang leaders command hundreds of highly trained, well armed followers. In comparison, Real life offenders, often people with very limited resources, offer poor material for entertaining plots. See box 5.6. Sociologists often complain that popular culture's conventional focus on individuals rather than social forces. Novels, movies, and television series tend to match good people with heroic virtues against bad people with villainous vices, instead of exploring how social problems emerge from social arrangements. Thus, when racism appears in popular culture, it is often treated as a sort of personality defect. Villains and other unsympathetic characters express racist sentiments, thereby affirming their poor character. Where sociologists view racism as a widespread problem with roots in social arrangements and consequences for the larger society. Popular culture often treats racism as a personal characteristic of flawed individuals because the formula requiring a hero to triumph over a particular villain. Similarly, talk shows and other genres that mix elements of news and entertainment feature the same emphasis on flawed individuals. They present problem gambling as a psychological compulsion that affects some individuals, rather than emphasizing how social institutions, such as government and the gaming industry, exacerbate the problem by promoting gambling. In other words, the formulas used in entertainment media highlight stories about individuals. Citation Burns 2004. This individual focus is found in both fictional pop culture genres such as mystery novels and the quasi news of infotainment such as talk shows. Entertainment media may address social problems claims, but regardless of whether primary claims makers view a problem as widespread and systematic, think about claims of racism, environmental degradation, or climate change, entertainment tends to translate those claims into stories about the struggles and successes of particular people. This focus on telling compelling stories about individuals is central to the formula for many entertainment genres, and the people who work as creators and producers within the media understand the need to focus on typifying individuals. This means that the entertainment media have an especially difficult time adopting what C. Wright Mills, 1959, called a sociological imagination. That is, viewing the world in terms of social arrangements and social forces. Mills noted that in everyday life, people focus on their private troubles, such as not having a job. Adopting a sociological imagination requires seeing those private troubles in terms of larger public issues. For example, whereas an individual may have trouble finding a job, the larger society confronts the more general problem of unemployment. Sociologists then tend to downplay the experiences of individuals and focus on larger social patterns. To use concepts from chapter 3 and 4, the sociological imagination can be understood as the frame that sociologists as experts use to construct social problems. No wonder sociologists, as well as many primary claims makers, often criticize the entertainment media's portrayal of social problems. By translating claims into dramatic tales of individual suffering and redemption, the media favor constructions that run counter to more sociological interpretations. New section. What about social media? Do social media, think Facebook, Twitter, and the like, belong in a chapter on media coverage of claims making? This chapter has been using the word media as shorthand to refer to what were traditionally called mass media, that is, methods of communicating a message to a very large audience, such as a newspaper, television, film, and the like. So the question becomes, are social media a form of mass media? Certainly, lots of people participate in social media. Facebook reports having more than 2 billion active users, and there are individuals, mostly entertainers, with tens of millions of Twitter followers. So the total social media audience is huge. However, it is also diffuse. Facebook is individualized. Each user maintains a set of friends. The median number of Facebook friends is 200, meaning that half of all users have fewer than that number. The average Twitter user has 700 followers. These are hardly mass audiences. Social media are most likely to affect the social problems process as a means of drawing attention to claims. In addition to entertainers, those with vast numbers of Twitter followers include political leaders who may use Twitter as a platform for making brief claims, and major news organizations such as the New York Times and CNN Breaking News that hope to redirect their Twitter followers to some of their coverage on their websites. We might think of these as institutional participants in social media. But of course, most communication via social media occurs between individuals, and they too can draw attention to claims. In a few spectacular cases, usually involving a good deal of deliberate marketing, a claim can, quote, go viral and reach millions of people. Citation Madian, Madianou 2013. Uh, Madiano. In other cases, claims makers may try to package claims in ways that will maximize their chance of spreading widely. Even if most people have only a few hundred people in their own social media network, because each of those contacts has his or her own network of friends and followers, there are plenty of possibilities for transmitting information quickly to large numbers of people through these connections. If you share or signal that you like something to those in your network, and if they choose to pass it along to their contacts, who in turn pass it along, it is possible for the information to truly reach large audiences. The information that spreads in this manner is not necessarily accurate. In fact, there is some solid evidence that inaccurate information spreads further and faster on social media than accurate information does. See box 5.7. People tend to have social media contacts who share many of their characteristics, not just age and social class, but also opinions. In general, conservatives probably have a lot of other conservatives among their contacts, just as liberals have more liberals. This means that information that spreads via social media networks tend to travel among those with similar views, who are more likely to pass it along and less likely to critically examine information they receive from one another. Critics warn that this creates echo chambers and filter bubbles in which individuals communicate largely with those who share their views. If mass media increasingly targets segmented populations and markets, social media replicate that segmentation. Another aspect of social media is that it can serve as a forum for recruiting members to a cause. In recent years, social movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Me Too for sexual harassment, and Never Again MSD regarding school shootings have emerged with a strong social media presence, including popular hashtags on Twitter and Instagram. These campaigns have shown the ability to mobilize large numbers of followers fairly quickly through social media, and they have received considerable attention from traditional news media that tend to treat them in basically the same ways that they've always covered social movements. Although some sociologists suggest that these movements may be transforming activism, citation Milkman 2017, others argue that the potential for social media driven campaigns may be limited. Traditional social movements often require commitments of time and energy from their members, whereas announcing that you share some sentiment with your contacts on social media demands little effort. Online declarations of support for social movements are sometimes dismissed as slacktivism. The degree to which movements based on social media can endure is uncertain. Citation Tufekci, 2017. In other words, there is evidence that social media can become a factor in the social problems process, although social media are such a new phenomenon that relatively little research has been done on this topic. We will return to social media in Chapter 6 when we consider their uses in public reactions to claims making. Critics worry that media constructions, whether in the news or entertainment genres or in social media, are important because they are influential. That is, it seems obvious that people who follow the news, consume entertainment, or surf the web must be affected by how these media portray social problems. But is this true? New section: the media's impact. Commentators often assume that the media are extremely powerful and influential, that members of audiences are regularly affected by media messages. To be sure, most of us would deny that we personally are easily manipulated by the media. We are made of stronger stuff. We take an attitude of healthy skepticism towards messages in the news, entertainment, and advertising. But others, we worry, must easily be bamboozled by media and may require protection. The media's powerful influence may seem obvious, but it turns out to be fairly difficult to document. Consider claims that televised violence leads to violent behavior. Television is nearly universal in our society, which makes it difficult to construct experimental studies of its effects since there is no natural control group lacking exposure to television. Yet most people do not engage in violent acts. Similarly, most people who view commercials do not rush out to purchase the advertised products. Although claims makers insist that the media exposure has damaging effects, it is hard to observe and measure these consequences. Clearly, the media don't have the same effect on everyone. If we are to understand the media's role in the social problems process, we need to specify what forms its influence might take. One thing we might mean is that the media can bring a social problem to public attention. As we've already noted, this is a central goal of many claims makers. When claims makers are calling attention to a new problem, that is, to a troubling condition that has been generally neglected or ignored, one that is unfamiliar to many people, getting media coverage can bring the topic out into the open. Media attention can make the public aware that the issue exists or encourage the public to think that something ought to be done to remedy the problem. This is something called agenda setting. Citation McCombs 2004. Just as a meeting may be guided by an agenda, a list of topics to be addressed, usually in order of importance, we can envision a society's members as needing to prioritize their concerns. All people have countless topics competing for their attention. Many of these concern the individual's personal lives, routines, errands, conversations with friends and relatives, and so on. The media, particularly the news media, provides some sense of what's occurring in the larger world, suggesting what else deserves people's notice. Media coverage then can make people aware of a social problem, get it on society's agenda. Agenda setting can affect both public awareness, as will be discussed in Chapter 6, and policymakers' sense of what deserves their attention, covered in Chapter 7. Note that the media do not have a free hand in agenda setting. They are constrained. First, some events, say a major disaster, may demand media coverage. Second, the media can be influenced to cover particular topics by claims makers who convince the media that a problem deserves their attention, by officials who herald a particular new policy, even by other media outlets whose coverage suggests that a topic must be worthy of coverage. Third, as we have already noted, people working in the news and entertainment media are limited by the resources available to them, by their sense of the sort of coverage they ought to produce, and so on. Nevertheless, in one sense, the media make choices that are consequential. We have already noted that the media translate and transform social problems claims. In the case of contentious issues, topics, such as abortion, about which claims makers may advance contradictory claims, media coverage can structure the debate by assembling a small set of claims making packages. Although the media cannot force people to adopt particular ideas, they make some constructions readily available, so it is easier to come to understand social problems in particular ways. In some cases, media coverage may give individuals a new perspective on their personal lives to help them redefine their personal troubles as part of a larger set of social problems. The public and policymakers pay attention to what the media cover for a couple of reasons. First, they use the media as a source of information. Media coverage may be how the public and policymakers first learn about a particular social problem. Second, policymakers who policymakers may begin to hear from members of the general public who, having learned about the problem via the media, may call for action. Although the media are by no means all powerful, they do help shape the social problems process. New section, the media and the social problems process. This is the final section. Part of the reason why commenters exaggerate the media's power is the media plays an especially visible role in the social problems process. Outsider claims makers view media coverage as almost essential for making the public and policymakers aware of their claims. More powerful people use press coverage and other public relations techniques to attract and shape coverage for their activities. Meanwhile, lobbying and other inside claim making is hidden from the public unless an enterprising reporter draws attention to it. Media coverage remains the easiest way for most people to learn about social problems. This chapter has argued that the media must also be understood in terms of their social arrangements. Figure 5.1 illustrates some of the key features of these arrangements. First, note the distinction between news and entertainment media. The figure portrays news coverage as occurring first and often shaping entertainment media's coverage of social problems. Second, the figure draws attention to the role of cultural resources. News workers' sense of what is newsworthy, as well as how news stories should be assembled and reported, depend in part on their understanding of how the larger culture will make sense of claims. A parallel set of considerations will shape what will be considered entertaining. Finally, note that both news and entertainment media have their own organizational constraints, operating budgets, production schedules, established conventions and formulas, and so on, that also influence what the media produce. In addition, the media constantly receive feedback. Most obviously, they worry about the reactions of their audiences. Are people interested in the news or entertainment they produce? If not, the media are likely to modify what they're doing. The media may also hear from claims makers who offer congratulations or complaints about coverage, from segments of the general public who are not in their target audience and who often have their own criticisms, and from policymakers who may endorse or challenge what the media have done. The people who work in the media, then, should not be seen as all powerful, as able to dictate what others think. Rather, they are connected to, and thereby influenced by, the other actors in the social problems process. And just as the media transforms and translate primary claims into the secondary claims presented in news coverage or entertainment, the media's audience, the public, reworks those messages for its own purpose. That is the end of chapter 5.